Imagine reels of film so shocking that police raided theaters to pull them off the screen. In the 1980s, exploitation cinema wasn't just entertainment, it was a cultural battlefield. These were movies that dared to go too far. Governments panicked, critics fainted, and film reels disappeared into evidence lockers. But behind every seizure was an artist trying to test how far society would bend before it snapped. Number 14. Cannibal Ferox, 1981. Few films have provoked the kind of disgusted fascination that Cannibal Ferox did. Marketed as the most violent film ever made, this Italian exploitation shocker by Umberto Lenzi was both banned and seized in multiple countries. On the surface, it looked like another jungle adventure gone wrong. But beneath the grime and gore lay a dark satire on Western hypocrisy. The story followed a group of young Americans traveling to the Amazon to debunk myths of cannibal tribes. But the tables turn as they find themselves at the mercy of the very people they came to exploit. Lenzi shot the film in Colombia with a reckless intensity that blurred the line between fiction and cruelty. Many scenes were accused of depicting real harm to animals, triggering outrage from animal rights groups and censors alike. In Britain, Cannibal Ferox became a symbol of the video nasties panic. Police raided video shops and seized copies under the Obscene Publications Act. Critics called it depraved. Fans called it daring. And decades later, it stands as one of the most infamous exploitation films ever made, hated for its brutality, but admired for its raw audacity. The legacy of Cannibal Ferox reminds us that the boundary between cinema and obscenity is often drawn in fear, not reason. Number 13. I Spit on Your Grave, 1980. Released under a whisper and banned in dozens of territories, I Spit on Your Grave remains one of the most divisive films in exploitation history. Directed by Mayor Zarchi, it was condemned by critics, seized by authorities, and even banned outright in several countries for being too extreme. Yet its story was born not out of shock value but personal rage. The plot centered on a woman writer who retreats to a rural cabin, only to face unimaginable cruelty from locals. But what made the film so infamous wasn't just what it showed, it was what it dared to say about revenge and trauma. Zarchi had based the film on a real-life assault he once witnessed, determined to turn vengeance into defiance. But audiences in the early 1980s weren't ready. The film was yanked from theaters, burned in some regions, and dismissed as moral poison. Despite being torn apart by censors, it found a cult following through underground VHS circulation. Feminist scholars later revisited it as an early conversation about power and justice, though even they struggled with its imagery. Today, I Spit on Your Grave stands as a haunting reminder that exploitation cinema, at its core, reflected the ugliest corners of society's silence. It wasn't made to entertain. It was made to haunt. Number 12. The Driller Killer, 1979 but banned well into 1980. When Abel Ferrara's The Driller Killer hit the shelves of Britain's early home video boom, it didn't just spark controversy, it ignited a national moral panic. Though filmed in the late 1970s, it became one of the most seized titles of the 1980s under the video nasties crackdown. Its cover alone, a screaming man impaled by a drill, was enough to send police into action. The story followed a struggling artist losing his mind in the decaying streets of New York. Driven by poverty, isolation, and rage, he begins a killing spree with his power drill as his only release. Ferrara's grim portrayal of urban collapse was shot guerrilla style, often without permits, capturing the raw rot of Manhattan before gentrification. Censors missed the satire entirely. To them, The Driller Killer was a manual for madness, a film that might drive viewers to imitate its violence. Video stores were raided, copies confiscated, and distributors fined. Ferrara himself claimed he was misunderstood, that the film was about society drilling holes in its own soul. Yet, as decades passed, critics recognized its gritty artistry. What once was seized as obscene is now studied as an underground masterpiece. The Driller Killer proved that sometimes the most disturbing horror isn't supernatural, it's born from everyday despair. Number 11. Faces of Death, 1978, but seized throughout the 1980s. When Faces of Death first appeared on VHS shelves in the early 1980s, it came with a warning label claiming that everything you are about to see is real. That single phrase was enough to make it one of the most seized, banned, and whispered about films in exploitation history. Directed by John Allen Schwartz under the pseudonym Conan LeSalaire, the film presented itself as a morbid documentary about death in all its forms, from accidents to executions. In truth, Faces of Death mixed real footage with cleverly staged scenes, but in the age before the internet, audiences couldn't tell the difference. The illusion of authenticity caused widespread panic. Authorities in the United Kingdom confiscated the film during the infamous Video Nasties sweep. Religious groups called it evil incarnate. Some viewers reportedly fainted in theaters, believing they had witnessed genuine death. Behind the scenes, Schwartz defended the movie as a grim commentary on human fascination with mortality. He argued that society's real sickness wasn't the footage, it was our appetite for it. But that argument fell flat in courtrooms and media debates. Police seized copies across Europe, while the film was outlawed entirely in countries like Norway and New Zealand. Over time, however, Faces of Death became a bizarre cultural artifact. Bootleg copies circulated among curious teens, and later generations realized it had predicted the reality-obsessed media culture of today. It blurred the line between documentary and performance, horror and reality. What once was banned for corrupting the public became a cautionary mirror, showing how easily shock can masquerade as truth. Few films captured the moral confusion of the 1980s as completely as Faces of Death. Number 10. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. No film defined cinematic outrage in the 1980s quite like Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust. Banned in more than 50 countries and seized by authorities on multiple continents, it was so convincing that its director was arrested for murder. The film followed a rescue team sent into the Amazon to recover footage shot by missing documentarians, footage that revealed unimaginable cruelty and deception. Shot in the Colombian jungle, Cannibal Holocaust blurred reality and fiction to such a degree that Deodato was accused of making a snuff film. The infamous scenes of real animal killings and shocking violence provoked fury worldwide. Italian police confiscated every print they could find. The director was jailed until he proved that his actors were still alive. In Britain, it topped the Video Nasties blacklist, leading to police raids and moral protests. Yet beneath its notoriety was a disturbing critique of Western exploitation itself. Deodato wasn't glorifying savagery, he was condemning it, exposing the hypocrisy of so-called civilized media that profited from suffering. Critics were split. Some called it sadistic trash, others called it accidental genius. Decades later, film scholars saw its influence in found-footage horror and documentaries about media ethics. Today, Cannibal Holocaust stands as both artifact and accusation, a film that forced audiences to ask whether watching cruelty makes us complicit. It remains banned in several countries, yet it continues to be studied in film schools. It's proof that the most dangerous art doesn't always tell us what we want to hear. It tells us what we refuse to face. Number 9. Nekromantik, 1987. Few films ever tested the boundaries of censorship and morality like Nekromantik. Released in West Germany at the end of the 1980s, Jörg Buttgereit's film wasn't just banned, it was hunted. Authorities seized copies, raided video stores, and even banned Buttgereit from publicly screening his own work. For years, Nekromantik was whispered about as the most disgusting film ever made. But its infamy masked a deeply tragic vision. The story followed a lonely street cleaner who collects body parts for comfort, exploring loneliness and decay in post-industrial Berlin. Buttgereit shot it on a shoestring budget using amateur actors and improvised sets. What shocked authorities wasn't simply what was shown, but how artistically it was presented. It felt intimate, poetic, and disturbingly sincere. Critics didn't know whether to laugh, vomit, or applaud. German police seized the negatives under obscenity laws, arguing the film endangered public morality. Even horror festivals refused to touch it. But as VHS bootlegs spread across Europe, Nekromantik became an underground phenomenon. Fans saw past the surface grotesquerie and recognized its melancholy, a reflection on alienation and obsession in a society afraid of death. Buttgereit insisted it was not about shock, but emotion, the tenderness between the grotesque and the human. Today, it's celebrated as avant-garde art disguised as horror. What was once seized and silenced now screens in museums. Nekromantik proved that censorship often says more about a culture's fear of emotion than about art itself. Number 8. Thriller, A Cruel Picture. 1981 reissue seized in multiple countries. In the early 1980s, European customs officials had a new target. Swedish cult film Thriller, A Cruel Picture. Originally shot in the mid-1970s but reissued and rediscovered during the exploitation boom, it was seized in several countries after being labeled morally unfit for public exhibition. Directed by Bo Arne Vibenius, it told the harrowing tale of a young woman brutalized and left voiceless, who transforms herself into a deadly avenger. The film's icy tone and minimalist style stood out in a genre known for excess. Vibenius shot it with clinical precision, combining cold cinematography with long, silent moments that made the violence even more unsettling. But when the reissue hit the booming VHS market of the early 1980s, authorities pounced. The British Board of Film Classification refused to rate it. Customs officers seized entire shipments, and even Sweden distanced itself from what became known as, they call her one eye. Behind the scenes, Vibenius had worked secretly, allegedly using government film funds meant for a children's project. When that revelation surfaced, the scandal deepened. Critics attacked him for immorality, yet underground audiences found something strangely empowering in its story of survival and retaliation. Quentin Tarantino later called it one of his inspirations for Kill Bill, honoring its stark visuals and themes of vengeance. Over time, Thriller, A Cruel Picture, shifted from contraband to cult classic. Restored versions now screen at festivals that once would have confiscated it. What was once seized for its supposed obscenity is now celebrated for its raw artistry. The film endures as a reminder that what authorities fear most is often the power of a story told without apology. Number 7. Combat Shock, 1984. When Combat Shock arrived in the mid-1980s, audiences weren't ready for its brutal honesty. Directed by Buddy Giovinazzo, this micro-budget nightmare was less a war movie and more a descent into the mind of a shattered veteran. It told the story of a Vietnam survivor trapped in urban decay, haunted by guilt, unemployment, and poverty. It was marketed as exploitation, but what it delivered was raw despair. Censors didn't know what to do with it. Some thought it was too violent, others said it was too depressing, and several distributors refused to handle it. In certain European countries, customs officers seized copies under laws against violent or degrading material. Even American television stations that briefly aired it in late-night slots received viewer complaints that it looked too real. For many, Combat Shock crossed a psychological line few dared to explore. Giovinazzo shot the film in Staten Island using friends and local abandoned buildings, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere that mirrored the emotional collapse of his lead character. The final act, an unforgettable spiral into madness, cemented its place among the most disturbing independent films of the decade. But as time passed, Combat Shock found its defenders. Critics began calling it the taxi driver of underground cinema. It wasn't exploitation, it was expressionism disguised as horror. By the 2000s, restored editions were released, and film historians recognized its influence on gritty urban storytelling. What was once seized and condemned is now remembered as one of the most emotionally devastating portraits of post-war trauma ever committed to film. Its message still cuts deep. War doesn't always end on the battlefield. Number 6. Deadbeat at Dawn, 1988. Jim Van Bebber's Deadbeat at Dawn was the kind of movie that could only have come from the lawless edges of 1980s independent cinema. Shot over 4 years in Ohio with barely any budget, it became notorious for its ferocious violence and punk anarchy. Upon its release, local authorities confiscated screenings and seized home copies, claiming it promoted urban terrorism. In reality, it was a chaotic love letter to self-destruction. The story followed a gang leader named Goose, who tries to leave his life of crime after the death of his girlfriend. But revenge pulls him back into a vortex of blood and betrayal. Van Bebber not only directed and wrote the film, he performed his own stunts, including real rooftop jumps and dangerous fight sequences filmed without permits. It felt dangerous because it was. Censors didn't see it as art. They saw it as incitement. Police in the American Midwest reportedly halted underground showings, and European distributors were warned not to import it. Despite the crackdown, the movie spread through mail-order VHS trading, turning Van Beber into a cult hero. His guerrilla filmmaking style influenced later independent directors who embraced raw realism over studio polish. Years later, Deadbeat at Dawn was reevaluated as a work of authenticity and rebellion. Its energy was pure and unfiltered, a cry from the fringes of a decade obsessed with control. What was once seized in panic now stands as a defiant statement. True cinema doesn't always play by the rules, and sometimes that's exactly what makes it immortal. Number 5. Last House on Dead End Street, 1980 re-release. When Last House on Dead End Street resurfaced in the early 1980s home video market, authorities didn't know what to make of it. Shot years earlier by Roger Watkins under several pseudonyms, the movie's origins were as murky as its imagery. Distributors often advertised it as a snuff film, and when it appeared on tape in Europe, police literally raided stores to confiscate it. The story centered on a bitter ex-filmmaker who, disillusioned by the industry, begins creating horrifying underground movies using real victims. The film's grim 16mm texture and incoherent editing made it feel disturbingly authentic, convincing viewers that what they were seeing might actually be real. In Britain and Germany, censors declared it obscene and unfit for public release. Rumors spread that the film was cursed, or that its crew had vanished after completion. Behind the scenes, Watkins had created the movie as a nihilistic reflection on the corruption of fame and the emptiness of art without morality. But no one in the 1980s cared for philosophy. They saw only depravity. Distributors retitled and recut it repeatedly, making the film even more infamous. Copies were seized at ports and police stations treated it like contraband. Years later, researchers uncovered the truth. The film was shot by a group of young Americans in upstate New York with minimal resources and a lot of anger. Far from a snuff film, it was a desperate scream against exploitation itself. Today, Last House on Dead End Street stands as one of cinema's strangest survivors, a work that was once seized for obscenity but endures as a warning about how easily fear can erase art. Number 4. Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, 1981. Few exploitation films triggered as much real-world legal fallout as Nightmares in a Damaged Brain. Released in the United Kingdom during the height of the video nasties panic, this psychological horror from Romano Scavolini was seized under obscenity laws and even landed its distributor in jail. The film's reputation as a banned masterpiece spread faster than its limited theatrical run ever did. The plot followed a recently released psychiatric patient whose trauma manifests in terrifying hallucinations and violence. Scavolini directed with raw intensity, mixing surreal dream sequences with moments of shocking realism. The editing blurred reality and nightmare until the two became indistinguishable. British tabloids labeled it a training film for maniacs. Customs officers seized copies nationwide. In 1984, a British distributor named David Hamilton Grant was sentenced to prison for distributing it. Behind the chaos was a strange irony. Scavolini claimed he wanted to explore mental illness, not glorify violence. The special effects by Tom Savini added another layer of myth. Censors believed the gore was too convincing, while fans traded bootlegs in secret. For years, it was the holy grail of forbidden horror. When it finally resurfaced legally decades later, critics were surprised by its grim artistry. Beneath the blood lay a haunting portrait of guilt, trauma, and moral decay. Nightmares in a Damaged Brain became proof that censorship often amplifies the very terror it seeks to suppress. What once was seized as filth is now studied as a fearless experiment in psychological horror. Number 3. Tenebrae, 1982. By the early 1980s, Italian maestro Dario Argento had already reinvented horror, but Tenebrae pushed even him into dangerous territory. This sleek, neon-lit thriller about an author stalked by a fan obsessed with his violent books was banned and seized across the United Kingdom. Police confiscated VHS copies under suspicion of promoting sadistic impulses, and critics called it murderous pornography. Yet Argento's real weapon was intellect. Shot in Rome's modernist suburbs, the film blended murder mystery with biting commentary on media hysteria. Argento used reflective surfaces, long tracking shots, and pulsating music to show how violence consumes both artist and audience. Authorities didn't appreciate the nuance. During the video nasties sweeps, Tenebrae was one of the first titles seized, bundled alongside far less sophisticated films. The irony was brutal. Argento's film was about censorship itself, and censorship became its fate. Behind the camera, Argento battled producers who wanted to tone down the violence. He refused. The film premiered to outrage, then vanished from shelves when raids began. For decades, only blurry bootlegs kept it alive. Then came the twist. Modern critics reevaluated Tenebrae as one of the decade's great meta-horrors. Its commentary on obsession and repression now feels prophetic. Today, it stands not as a film that corrupted viewers, but one that exposed how easily society confuses reflection for endorsement. Once seized as evidence of moral decay, Tenebrae endures as Dario Argento's sharpest blade, a masterpiece forged in controversy and polished by time. Number 2. The Evil Dead, 1981. Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead wasn't just another low-budget horror flick. It was a cinematic explosion that terrified censors as much as audiences. When it debuted, no one could believe such relentless chaos could be achieved on a tiny budget. Shot in a remote Tennessee cabin by a group of college friends, the film combined manic camera work, eerie sound design, and unrelenting violence into something raw and otherworldly. Its story was simple. A group of friends finds an ancient book in the woods and unknowingly awakens a demonic presence that possesses them one by one. But the execution was unlike anything audiences had seen. Raimi's unhinged direction, Bruce Campbell's manic performance, and gallons of fake blood pushed it into new extremes of cinematic madness. Authorities in the United Kingdom were not amused. As the video nasties, panic took hold. The Evil Dead was one of the most aggressively seized titles. Police stormed video shops, pulling tapes off shelves and treating them as criminal contraband. Religious groups denounced it as an invitation to evil. Distributors faced prosecution, and even the film's poster was banned in some towns. But here's the twist. Critics who dared to look past the hysteria saw genius. Horror master Stephen King called it the most ferociously original horror film of the year, giving it the push that helped it spread worldwide through underground screenings and fan networks. Over time, it became the very definition of a cult classic. What was once seized as dangerous corruption is now studied as independent filmmaking perfection. The Evil Dead turned fear itself into art and showed that censorship can't kill creativity. It simply fuels it. The movie that once terrified authorities is now enshrined as a masterpiece of fearless imagination, proof that terror can be beautiful when it's born from passion, not hate. Number 1. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1982 reissue seizures. Few films in history have been seized, banned, and misunderstood as often as Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Though originally released in the 1970s, it was the 1980s reissue on VHS that unleashed pure chaos. Authorities across Europe confiscated copies under obscenity laws, and in Britain, the film remained banned for years. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, its repression, it became legend. The story was raw simplicity. A group of travelers encounters a deranged family in rural Texas. But what audiences couldn't shake was its realism. The handheld cinematography, the heat-soaked atmosphere, the sound of chains grinding metal, all of it felt too real. Rumors spread that the film was based on true events, which only deepened its infamy. Police seized shipments at ports, calling it a moral threat. Newspapers demanded investigations. Behind the scenes, Hooper's production had been a nightmare of sweat and madness. The actors endured unbearable heat and exhaustion. The dinner scene, now one of cinema's most famous, was shot for over 26 hours straight in a room filled with rotting food. What emerged wasn't a splatter film, but a grotesque satire of the American dream, a world where consumption and cruelty fed each other endlessly. By the time censors realized what they were banning, it was too late. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre had already become myth. Bootleg copies spread like wildfire, turning it into the most infamous home video of the decade. Today, it stands as one of the most important horror films ever made, a movie seized for being too brutal, yet revered for being too honest. Its legacy proves that the line between art and obscenity is often drawn not by artists but by those too afraid to understand them. In the 1980s, the war on exploitation films wasn't just about gore, it was about control. These movies pushed back, daring audiences to look at what society wanted hidden. Decades later, they remind us that banning a story doesn't erase it, it immortalizes it. Which of these forbidden films would you dare to watch? Like, subscribe, and tell us below.